Hello, everybody. How are things going? So today I'm here to tell you everything you need to know about Nietzsche in 15 minutes, which hopefully you figured out is completely impossible. There's no way I can cover every single concept and look at every single nuance of this particular essay that we're discussing for today. But what I can do is give you a way of approaching the text, a way of thinking about Nietzsche's work. And I think this is also going to help you as you move forward throughout the class, right? And so, especially when we get to Michel Foucault and other sort of dense theoretical works that we're going to look at later in the quarter, think back to the discussion we're going to have now. And I think some of the things that we talk about are going to apply to those future works as well, right? So, anyway, I want to start off by saying that I have a relationship with Nietzsche, right? I first encountered his work as a young undergraduate. And I loved his work so much that I ended up buying a What Would Nietzsche Do baseball cap. At the time, the phrase WWJD, which was What Would Jesus Do, was really popular. And so I got one that said WWND with What Would Nietzsche Do underneath. I thought that was like really clever and witty and controversial or whatever. And I used to wear it, especially when I went out running. I used to wear it all over the place in the multiple conservative communities that I found myself in. And eventually it sort of disintegrated and it fell apart because I wore it so much, right? It's hard to explain. It just ended up a pile of mush, basically. And so I ended up having to throw it away, which was a really sad moment in my life, right? And of course, I'm not the only person that fell in love with Nietzsche as a as in their youthful age. It's hard to understate Nietzsche's influence in the 20th century. The existentialists, the early 20th century thinkers like Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre were all heavily influenced by his work. The postmodernists later, like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, were extremely influenced by him. And even people that you wouldn't think of, like Ayn Rand, for example. Her original version of the Fountainhead had a quote from Nietzsche in each one of her chapters. Hitler read Nietzsche's work, right, and obviously was influenced by him to a certain degree. And there is, I want to preface this before we get started. There is this sort of rumor that Nietzsche was a Nazi or had sympathies with Nazi ideology, and of course that's overblown, right? I mean, Nietzsche wasn't alive during the Nazi period, and really it's impossible to know what he would have thought about them, right? However, the association originally came about because his sister managed his estate, and his sister was a Nazi, right? And so she helped sort of push the connection between Nietzsche's ideas and Nazism, right? And so that there is a kind of connection there, but it isn't a direct one. So that's something that's important to keep in mind, right? Anyway, right, so Nietzsche has this huge influence. And so it's really important, I think, for everybody to read at least one of his essays at one point in their lives, right? So a few facts about his life before we get started. There are a few things that I want you to know about him that I think will influence how you think about his ideas, right? So first off, he has the greatest mustache of any philosopher. You may say that's subjective, that that's an opinion, but it is not. Is in fact it is an established truth. So if you look at these pictures here, you will see how mighty it was. Especially this one in the lower left-hand corner here is particularly awesome. And if I could grow a Nietzsche like that, or a Nietzsche, if I could grow a mustache like that and it was socially acceptable, you can bet your ass that I would. So first thing to know, he has an amazing mustache, and I think that's really important. The second thing is that he wrestled a lot with mental illness. And there are probably a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that he got into an accident during the Franco-Prussian War, broke some bones and things like that, and it might have had a lasting impact on his body. So that's one reason. He also probably contracted syphilis. There's some debate about this, but there's a good possibility of it. It was a very common ailment in that particular time period. He ended up going insane around middle age, right? And in fact, his work became popular right at the moment when he slipped into madness. So it's very appropriate that he ended up becoming world renowned just at the time where he could not be aware of it, right? So anyway, he battled a lot with mental illness, and it's well known that he, had chronic migraines, that his body was in pain on a regular basis, and there's no question that suffering sort of impacted his outlook on life in some ways, right? He also was really lonely. He had trouble getting along with people, especially with women. His failed relationships with women are notorious. He got involved in multiple love triangles where he ended up being the odd man out. There was one woman he asked to marry him 3 times, and she continued to refuse him. And so he had a lot of trouble with women and was very lonely for a substantial period of his life. Also, he came from a family of preachers and pastors. And that tends to be a problem if you're one of the most notorious atheists of the 19th century. And so he was disowned by his own family and wasn't even able to retain a connection to them. So that's also extremely problematic, right? And then finally, he might have had some trouble with women because he was sexist. In fact, I'm willing to bet that there's a substantial reason behind it, although I don't really have any evidence to support that. In the opening of one of his books, Beyond Good and Evil, he says something like, supposing that truth is a woman, what then? Is there not ground for suspecting that all philosophers, insofar as they've been dogmatists, have failed to understand women, and so on and so forth? And his idea is that truth is kind of slippery and difficult to get a hold of, much like women are slippery and difficult to woo, and so forth, right? And this is just one example. There's multiple examples of him being a sexist pig throughout his work. Some people will try to disagree with that, but I would say that isn't warranted by the textual evidence that we have, right? And so that's another thing to keep in mind. His sexism unquestionably had an influence on his worldview, right? So with these things in mind, I want to turn to 3 key passages, right? And I'm going to try to give you some ways of thinking about these 3 key passages. And then when we're finished, I'm going to talk a little more about some ways of thinking about reading Nietzsche, right? So the first off is perhaps one of the most famous passages in the history of philosophy, right? This passage has been quoted and requoted and interpreted and reinterpreted over and over again. And it's hard to describe how big of an influence this single sentence has had on people, right? And so if you're looking for one passage to know from this essay, this is the one to know, right? And this is the place where he provides his definition of truth, right? So he says, what then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations which have been subjected to poetic and rhetorical intensification, translation, and decoration, in which, after they have been in use for a long time, strike a people as firmly established, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions, of which we have forgotten that they are illusions. Metaphors, which we have been worn by frequent use and have lost all sensuous vigor. Coins, which have lost their stamp and are no longer regarded, or are now regarded as metal and no longer coins, right? There's a lot to unpack here, and to be honest with you, it's sort of futile for me to even attempt to give you a full sense of what's going on here, right? But there are a few things that are important to keep in mind here, right? So when he says truth is a mobile army of metaphors, the first thing you should be seeing is that he's linking truth directly to language, right? So he's saying somehow the truth is housed in, is rooted in, is built from language in a certain sense, right? And so that's one of the key connections that he's making here, right? And then when he goes on to describe what it is, or in some respects what language is, right? He talks about it as a mobile army of metaphors, right? Is the key metaphor that he's using here, right? And it's important. One thing you got to remember when you're reading Nietzsche, right, is that a lot of what he's doing is taking familiar terms and applying them in new and unfamiliar ways, right? And we'll get at why he's doing that a little bit later, right? But a metaphor here is when we go to its like standard definition it's a comparison of 2 unlike things, right? So we use the term something's metaphorical when it's not literal. Basically, is the idea here, right? And he talks about how language in a lot of ways is built from metaphor, right? He says, so imagine you go outside and you see like a tree or something like that, right? The first thing that happens is your senses create an image of a tree based on light and numerous other impressions that you might have, right? And the important thing, though, for him, though, is that the tree that you see, the image that's formed in your head, is not the tree in itself, the actual tree out in reality, right? That's a metaphor, right? There's a connection that's being formed in your head between the image in here, right, and the thing that's out there. It's not a literal connection between those 2 things, right? And then he goes on to say, then there's another metaphor, right? We link a sound, a bunch of grunts that come out of our mouth with the image that we form of the tree, right? And that's how language is formed, the link between this concept in our head and the sound that comes into our mouth that fuse together to form a word, right? And once again, that's not a literal connection either. There's also a connection between two very unlike things. An image and a sound are two very different things, right? And so what he's saying, right, is that this mobile army of metaphors, right, isn't really reflective of reality when you get down to it, right? It's very much removed from and divorced from reality in certain respects, right? And then he goes on to say some other things too that are interesting that I think you should keep in mind, right? So one, he says, in short, a sum of human relations, right? And so what he means by that is that this mobile army of metaphors isn't innocent, right? It's based on our own experiences with the world, right? And importantly, our relations to other people and our relations to the world around us, right? And so the language itself sort of reflects our understanding and our perceptions of reality to begin with, right? And then this last part, which I think is easy to sort of like let slip by, I think is really important, where he says, there are coins which, having lost their stamp, are no longer regarded as metal, or are now regarded as metal and no longer coins, right? And the thing that's important here about coins, right, is that coins have value, right? And their value isn't determined by the metal that they're formed of, right? Their value is formed by the society around us, right? It's us that decide that a piece of paper that has George Washington's face on it is worth something, right? Does that make sense, right? And so what he's saying, right, is that the world of values and morality, right, is intertwined with the world of language, right? And mostly we've just forgotten about that, right? As words have been passed down over time, as meanings have been established in the social fabric around us, we forget where they come from, and we forget the sort of moral connotations of the language that we use, right? And so they become like metal, right? We view them like metal, even though when you actually get down to it, they are still coins, right? They still have value, whether we want to think of it that way or not, right? Another thing he says is he talks about the man of reason and the man of intuition, and man in quotation marks here, right? And I'm not going to read this quote here. He says, but he compares the man of reason as to someone which is needy, which clings on to the comfortable world of language that we find around us, right? And what he's trying to get at here is he's trying to think through how language changes, right? And his argument for how language changes is it's the artistic person, it's the clever person, it's the person of intuition who, as he puts it, smashes this framework, jumbles it up, and ironically reassembles it, pairing the most unlike things and dividing those things which are closest to one another, right? And so his argument here is that it's through art and through intuition that we can deconstruct the world around us and create new combinations from the world that already exists, right? And so in his mind, there is a way to move beyond the language that we've been born with, right? There are ways to sort of reassemble and reconstruct it, right? And lastly, he makes this claim about lies and truth, which are kind of interesting, right? And I think the important thing you can see him doing here is he's collapsing the difference between truth and lies, right? He's saying, what does it take to get someone to believe in a lie, right? It takes trickery, deception, right? It takes, you have to play your best rhetorical cards to get them to believe in something that is unreal, right? But then when you look at truth too, truth is in his mind also unreal, right? Truth is also not rooted in the real reality outside of ourselves either, right? And so there's kind of a connection between truth and lies here, right? Both of them, in his mind, require using illusions, trickery, deception to get us to believe in things, right? And so that gets us to our final thing, right? It's what you see Nietzsche doing a lot here is he's taking concepts that we're all familiar with and he's playing with them. He's doing new things with them and populating them with new meaning, right? And so what we have to do to understand him is we have to go along with him and along this path, right? Try to figure out what he's doing with these really familiar terms that we've come to come to just accept and not think about, right? So, for example, he does this with science. He's got a whole section on science, right? He does this for forgetting. He talks a lot about forgetting and seems to do new and unusual things with that particular concept, right? And so, when you're reading his work, this is the last thing I'll leave you with. Think through how he's applying these concepts in new and unusual ways.